friends. My name is Stephanie Romero, and I am the founder and executive director of Awaken Pittsburgh. I want to welcome you to our podcast, The Ripple Effect. Awaken Pittsburgh is a nonprofit dedicated to fostering well-being, empathy, and compassion for all by teaching and encouraging mindfulness and meditation practices. I also want to take a moment to let you know that Awaken Pittsburgh offers many other opportunities for practice and connection. For example, you can join our online community, which features a space to more deeply explore the topics we cover with our guests. We have weekly posts to spark thought, practice, and reflection. I hope you will come join us to explore, connect with others, and deepen your practice. You can find out more at awakenpittsburgh.org. Welcome to the Ripple Effect podcast. We are so excited today to have Brian Walsh joining us to talk about the topic of welcoming. Brian has been volunteering with Awaken Pittsburgh for more than 3 years and tirelessly has supported us in our work to spread mindfulness and meditation. Brian is a graduate of the University of Pittsburgh and currently resides in Somerville, Massachusetts. He is passionate about the variety of teachings out there that help us deepen our connection to ourselves, to others, and to life. Brian, I'm so excited to have this conversation with you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Of course, I'm excited to be here.
So I would love to first ask you if you could just talk about the role of meditation and mindfulness in your life.
Yeah, absolutely. It feels good to be asked this in like a context of being asked it. I feel like I'm always like bringing up meditation in like conversation, being like, damn it, I did it again. I brought up meditation in casual conversation again. So it's nice to be being offered to talk about it. But yeah, so to jump in, yeah, it's been a big part of my life for, I feel like ever since I started college, so like 7 years ago, I remember I kind of just stumbled upon it, wanting to do yoga to get more flexible. And that kind of parlayed into discovering meditation, which led itself to me devouring just like every resource I could find about it. And then being in Pittsburgh, that led me to Awaken too. But yeah, just for how it sits in my life now, and it's definitely changed and also stayed really the same in some ways of what the practice has been for me over the years. But I feel like fundamentally this whatever language I have around it, it feels like it's this time where I'm putting a little effort into like letting go of the storylines and like the narratives that are kind of bouncing around and throughout my head in the course of a day. And like I'm definitely kind of like a theology and spirituality like nerd. So I love like reading about different techniques and practices, but I also love like kind of seeing where they all like point back. And that really feels like I feel like that's something I found is like no matter what technique I feel like I'm using or practicing, it really feels like it's just this method of like maybe right now you don't have to worry about that. Like we're kind of realizing that I'm building these neural pathways throughout the day to kind of like think similar things, and then to give myself space in a day to just let that go. Just let it go. 20 minutes. Can you practice? Can you train the muscle of letting go? So I'll end with that, as I feel like meditation is really training the muscle of letting go.
That's amazing. I absolutely love that you define yourself as a spirituality nerd. That's really wonderful. I really, really love it. And I didn't know, like, this is always such a pleasure for me to do these conversations because I didn't know your entry point to meditation was yoga. So that's
Yeah.
also really wonderful to
Yep.
know. People have,
Yoga with Adrian on YouTube.
all
Yep.
right, well, there you go. There's our first resource for folks listening. Yoga with Adrian on YouTube. I love YouTube. Everything for free. Why pay?
Oh my God, it's such a treasure trove. I recently discovered this like old philosophy lecturer he just like like Michael Serguru, and he's like goes off on like all the great philosophers of the world and these like brilliant lectures. So I'm with you. YouTube is such a like incredible gift. Yeah.
That's awesome. So I also really heard this theme of letting go in your introduction to how mindfulness has been working in your life. So I'm really curious. It feels like the flip side of the coin of our topic for today, which is welcoming.
Mm.
Right? So there's this idea of we hold on to things and we need to let them go, but then there's this which could be considered opposite, but I don't really think it's
Mm.
opposite idea of welcoming. So I guess I want to ask what welcoming means to you, and
Yeah.
maybe if you see a connection to that letting go, it would be great to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's such a good point. That's so interesting because I so agree that welcoming, there's definitely, well, I'm sure we'll get to it. I feel like every time in these kind of things, when you get to some sort of paradox, it means you're actually onto something. It's like, that's actually, I used to think that was like a bad sign. Like, oh, no, I got myself into, that means my logic wasn't right. But typically I feel like I've learned that it actually means I'm closer to something. But for welcoming, yeah, I really think it's this yeah, I think it connects back to this idea of like space and like open. I think it's in like openness. Like there's a kind of like a felt sense to welcoming, in the sense of I feel like it's kind of is a feeling or a gesture that orients us away from like contraction, and closed offness, and is really kind of like shifting into like more of like an openness. And I think it happens in a lot of different contexts. So actually plug for the Mighty Networks channel that Dawn and I were working on. That's something we're kind of starting to explore this topic. And we kind of landed on this like kind of we thought there was like multiple different elements to welcoming, in the kind of sense that there's the internal like meditative welcoming, in the sense that when we're on the mat or wherever we're practicing meditation, there is this sense of welcoming whatever arises, as that's like a major part of the technique. Is you're not trying to resist what's arising. It kind of, and there's so many practices and beautiful language, depending on your tradition or what you're reading on like how that's kind of done. But I do think there's this true sense of, yeah, we're trying to not push against too hard whatever is present in our current experience. And so, yeah, kind of like making friends with it, which I know I've heard, I think Pember Chodron talk about as like a definition of meditation, like making friends with your mind. So that feeling, again, so now I'm trying to think about that letting go piece. That's such a fascinating thing. Like I'm trying to think of that piece, and there is, even though they're total opposites, they think they have this like very similar flavor, in the sense of like letting go of a need to dominate situation. And I think welcoming has that same thing. Like, say if you're welcoming a party of people into your house, which you can talk metaphorically or literally, like you can't really control how every single guest's going to behave. You're going to be stressed out the entire time if you're trying to like micromanage how every single thing is being experienced. I think this attitude of welcoming is yeah, kind of like letting go of our need to micromanage like every single element of our experience, and kind of allow things to be as they are. And again, I think letting go is that same thing. So yeah, I think they both kind of have this quality of like you said, of quality of openness to them, quality of like taking our hands off the wheel a little bit and letting things be as they are. Yeah. And then, yeah, I'll just kind of tie that knot of like the other elements of welcoming that Don and I were kind of talking about, being, yeah, there's like an internal welcoming of like our own experience. And then also in like day-to-day life, what comes out us externally, like as we move through the world, we can practice welcoming that. And then same thing with our experience with like relationships, so we can like create like welcoming, what's it feel like to create like welcoming spaces. So I think it's really cool. I think the beauty of so many of these ideas that you'll explore over these few months of podcasting is like there's always like these different like levels that like these ideas can be applied to, which I think makes them so fruitful. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really, really juicy. Like you said so much in there. The one thing that I loved is how you described it as a felt sense or a gesture. And so, as opposed to the contraction, right? As opposed to
Mm,
the contraction. And so I really love that way of framing welcoming because, when anything arises in our experience or in our life, like we feel that viscerally, whether or not we're opening
yeah.
or closing.
Yeah. And I think there's like a weird, in a sense, like again, connecting it back to like letting go is I think part of it is like in order to get to this feeling of welcoming, we kind of have to let go of a tendency to not want to welcome. Because I feel like sometimes the initial tendency is like, oh, say internal, oh, that's a feeling of anxiety. Oh, I like, or something in my stomach. I really want to push against that. I really do not want to like feel this right now. And I think like the letting go is kind of like, okay, can I let go in order to welcome it? So maybe in some ways the letting go is like precursor to the welcoming. Like to get to that sense of like openness, we need to kind of like notice and let go of that like tendency to contract. But even so, but then that's where the fun, like kind of like paradoxical nature of it is. We can't always force that. Sometimes when we're like contracting, we're contracting, and that's what our body's doing. So it's not even as much of like a conscious decision to stop contracting as
It's
it is
like
just kind of
it's
like being
like
okay with it.
yeah, it's like welcoming the contraction if you can't be welcoming,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Which then, yeah, exactly. And then the magic of that is so often then that become like turns into something new, or by nature of impermanence, that will eventually just become something new. Yeah, so that's always a really like fun place to like play around. Is like, you can't really try to give something up; it just kind of has to happen. But you're still gonna kind of try. It's yeah, that's like an ineffable space that I always like think is so fascinating. Is that like degree to like how much effort we put into these things, but I think that's the exploration of a lifetime.
Yeah, well said. And the interesting part right there is, and you're actually like naming exactly this topic, right? So how do you welcome the parts of your experience that you might otherwise want to push away? And the contracting is that pushing away, right? Is
Mm,
that I don't want this right now, right? And so in some sense, being able to let go of the need to control everything, which is what I think you were kind of naming
mm,
there, that is the only path, right, to being able to
mm.
welcome unexpected or undesired or unwanted, whatever in our
Yeah,
experience.
I agree. I think it's that control thing so huge in meditation. And that's why I think that can be the kind of scary part of meditation sometimes that people I don't think is like talked about a lot is like think we live a life of like it's common to like wanting to control things, which is natural and part of the human experience. But I think like when you're really sitting, you get to this point when like since we don't fundamentally have complete control of our entire of our of our experience, like eventually you'll have to let go. Eventually, like that's really the only option at a certain point. So as long as we like resist against that, we're kind of like I think we're kind of like pushing the ball down the line of like that needing to happen. So I think, and I don't think it's impossible to like really let go entirely in a moment, maybe at least for me. But like I think that's the practice. Well, yeah, we're practicing realizing that we don't practicing getting comfortable with the fact that we don't have control. And I think that and that letting go and that welcoming is really just like training that muscle of like, okay, I don't have control, which again is a scary space to be in. And okay, then that's the new thing we're welcoming is that like fear of it. And yeah, I mean, my mind's going to like Thich Nhat Hanh. He has some line about like the more you let go, the more free you are. Like when you totally let go, then it's like total freedom or something like that. yeah, so I think there's this relationship of like, yeah, the more we are able to practice letting go of our struggle against our need to control a situation, there's a correlate to like a feeling of like freedom and like we said, that like openness there.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that that openness is the welcoming,
Yeah, yeah.
right? Getting
Hmm.
getting to that spot where we're just letting it be and being open so that whatever shows up, we're like, yes, and this too. Okay.
Yeah. Which in all, yeah, and which so many times will be the feeling of I don't want this. You know what I mean? Like, so it's just like that. That's I think the real again juicy stuff is when you're practicing being like openness. You're feeling like the farthest thing from openness. So then you start like hammering yourself and like, oh, I was practicing being open and I'm so contracted right now. The only way out of that bind is to also open to that, is to also is openness. You have to like keep coming back to it. And and that's like a quality of like humor, I think, which I also think is in like the meditative path, is just like, oh my gosh, like this situation, it's almost silly. It's almost silly that like I know the only thing I need to do is open, and I'm trying so hard. I just need to remember to open again. And I think there's something funny about that.
And now, let's take a pause to update you on some upcoming events from Awaken Pittsburgh.
Pittsburgh, are you ready to open your mind and find peace within? Join us at Awaken Pittsburgh for an evening of guided meditation and community support. On Saturday, March 18th at 7 p.m., we open our doors at the Squirrel Hill Jewish Community Center for open meditation. Whether you're new to meditation or you've been practicing for years, our guided sessions are designed to welcome everyone. Experience the power of meditating in community. Our open meditation sessions include introductions, guided meditation, and the opportunity to share and discuss your practice. It's a chance to connect, learn, and grow together. Awaken Pittsburgh is dedicated to bringing peace and mindfulness to our community. To learn more about this event and others, visit us at awakenpittsburgh.org. Let's awaken together. See you on March 18th.
Now, back to our conversation. Yeah, I love the sense of humor part. Thank you for bringing that in because I think that is so important. And that is part of making friends with our mind, is being able to laugh at ourselves, right?
Mm.
And the journey and all the crazy that we find when we sit on the cushion, right?
Yeah.
Because it's all there, it's all happening, and it can
Yeah,
be funny.
my mind's so going to Dawn and I will actually share it next month, is like the Rumi guest house poem. But I think this analogy is really beautiful of like, I kind of alluded to it before, like our inner experience being like hosting a party. And I think it's a really like rich metaphor, because now I can even see if like I'm hosting a party and someone's like had a little bit too much to drink and they're like kind of like going off the walls. Like, how do we relate? What's the skillful way to relate to that person? It's never going to be, I think we all know, it's like very rarely going to be to like yell at them and like, oh, how dare you, which is how we often treat our emotions. Like, oh, how dare I be so angry right now, or whatever that emotion is. If we think of that guest as like an emotion, typically we're gonna kind of like come up to them being like, kind of try to like, hey buddy, like can we calm like I'm here. We're kind of like trying to be a friend to them, like, oh, I'm here, can we like calm down? And I think thinking of our like, if we think of ourselves as like the host of our minds, I think that it's a very interesting perspective on like, okay, how do we really treat these emotions when they arise? If we want to like play with the metaphor a little bit, if we want to like kind of have more of an active imagination in it, as opposed to just going into like the openness, I think it's an interesting practice of being like, it's almost like such a, I don't know, I get a lot of like warmth out of it. They're like, buddy, like anger, like, like I'm here for you. It's okay. Like, calm, like, I don't know. So I think trying to, I think it can be very rich to like kind of like do whatever we can to create like a loving relationship with what comes through us. Again, one of the amazing things I think about the meditative world and is there's so many like techniques and stuff, and we don't always we can pick one and do it forever. or we can kind of have like a repertoire. And I think there's like so many options to like what welcoming our inner experience looks like, because we're all so different, and and in different moments we feel different ways. So yeah.
Yeah, I love that too, that it's not going to look the same every day with everything that arises. And even the same thing arising on a different day may need a different thing, a different
Mhm.
practice, a different way of holding, a way of welcoming. Yeah, that's great. And I want to shift a little bit because we've been talking a lot about like the internal experience of welcoming. And you named a little bit earlier in the conversation, creating a welcoming space. And so I
Mm.
just wonder about the role of welcoming in your like work life, in your actual interaction with other human beings. So there's the, of course, the path of welcoming our inner experience and our own internal meditative work. But then for
Mhm.
me, what I really, really want is for that to translate out into how I show up in the world. So I'm just
Yeah.
curious what you're thinking on that.
Yeah. I think one of the most beautiful um expressions of like humanity is when we feel really safe in spaces. I think a lot of our world doesn't necessarily do that, especially for like depending on like the level of marginalization that you face. But I think people and groups of people that are able to really like create spaces where, oh, I can kind of like let my guard down here, is huge. It's inviting people into that letting go. It's giving people without them even needing the language to do it. I think a lot of people aren't in that space of letting go as a as a mechanism against like they need to not be letting go because there's a lot of like stuff coming at them, so they need to shield. So for when spaces can be cultivated where, oh, I can let go just without even the language, just because I feel accepted and seen, and that's so important. I think that's really, and I've been definitely graced to have experienced those kind of spaces before. I think it's even in like friendship, it's a really beautiful element of like friendship is like creating that space. So yeah, I think it's a really beautiful way to kind of like consider how we're moving through the world is like, am I kind of cultivating a space where someone can like feel like they can let their guard down in front of me, whether that be one-on-one or whether it be, okay, I'm hosting an event, and I'm creating a space. How do I kind of bring in that spirit of welcoming? Yeah, and I think it's really, I've been kind of thinking about it recently in connection to this like idea of like hospitality. And I think I think they're very like correlated in the sense of being like, it's just the ways we like show someone that we like care, people that we like care about them. And yeah, I think there's a lot there. But I think it's really, I think it's one of those things where we know it when we're in those kind of spaces. And it can be anyway, sometimes you can be it can be like I expected to go to this like opening it's a community I found online, and I went to their meeting, and of course it was like so nice and lovely, like it's an Awaken Pittsburgh event, and it's such a safe space, like that's so beautiful. But other times you can be at a restaurant and the waiter or the waitress or anyone at the restaurant just comes over, or the bus person, and this like that moment you're like, whoa. Sometimes I think we're like shocked by those moments, like, whoa, that person was so just like open. And even so, I think it can really happen in these like small moments. So I think it's a real testament to like how beautiful of work it is, because we don't really have to even try. I think there's at a certain level, when we're like hosting events, we do really need to try to make this as safe as possible, because we live in a world where it's like important to be, since a lot of people don't feel safe, to explicitly welcome marginalized like communities, and being like kind of like reiterate that in a verbal way. And then I think there's also just like the subtle stuff of like, oh wow, just by the nature of certain people's beings, they make people feel really safe and that they can put their guard down. Yeah, so I think it's a really beautiful thing when people are able to touch it, tap into that.
Yeah, you're naming partly, I think, psychological safety, right? Feeling that psychological safety, and that there is an element of just our being and how we show up and hold space that creates that. But then you're also naming, like, how do we actively work to make marginalized people feel safe in the spaces that we're holding, inviting them into, etc. So I think that there's a lot there, and I think I love this idea of welcoming as hospitality, right? Um, I'm always one who loves to host a dinner party and cook for people and, really provide that experience of just sharing a meal. And I think that could be, just as you were saying before, a metaphor for welcoming the other parts of people
Hmm.
into relationship with us, into intimacy, right?
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I'm so with you on like the hosting the parties, and that, like, it gets me thinking like, yeah, like what is it about that makes that such like an amazing feeling to like like do that? Is I think this innate like we want to be welcoming. I think there's this innate part of our like basic goodness is like it feels really good to like welcome people.
And then on the flip of that, right? So I'm just remembering a talk you named Pema Chodron earlier. I'm remembering a talk I heard by her, where she was talking about this kind of radical welcoming and, trying to welcome all, right? And she said, literally, she used the metaphor of the dinner party. She said, well, if you're hosting a dinner party and you only have space for 10, it's okay to only invite 10 right now. And maybe later you'll have a space that's large enough for 20 and you can invite 20. And so, really, just
Mm,
giving ourselves also permission to have those boundaries for ourselves so we can try to
mm.
do the radical welcoming and the radical hospitality, but also knowing, like, at this moment, I can only have 10 dinner guests.
Yeah, that's so true. That's really beautiful. Yeah, I love that because it's so true. It can be like, now I'm aware of this. I need to like open it up. And then that kind of, if we're not ready for that, it comes with like a big contraction. So I sometimes do think like, yeah, the wise effort is like, okay, let me try to like open up into the degree that feels right. Which again, I think has a core inner experience in the sense of um if something comes like I feel like you could probably speak to this better. I mean, you could definitely could like trauma informed mindfulness. If something comes up and like, okay, this is really not something I'm not in the space that I want to like look at this right now, whatever it is, like you don't have to. You know what I mean? No one's like forcing you to like to deal with like every single thing that's like coming up for you in your experience. Like it's like as you're ready, as you feel ready to open to this, to have a relationship with whatever's arising, you can, but you totally have this opportunity to set a boundary and being like, not right now. I don't really want to do this right now. And I think that's a really important thing to remember.
Yeah, and then in the trauma informed practice, there's this idea of titration, which, if you remember back to science, you have like this tube with the little lever on it and you titrate, right? So you let a little bit out, you let a little bit out, but you can close it back up. And so that idea, like, if something is really difficult that we want to push away, it's okay to just take a little bit out and see what that's
Hmm.
like, and close the valve, right?
Yeah.
And do it in little bits at a time, in little chunks,
Yeah.
little chunks. And that grows our capacity for welcoming over time, right? So, the fear that I experience, the anger that I experience, fill in the blank, whatever difficulty, the grief, whatever difficulty that is feeling overwhelming, can I just take a little nibble? Can I just nibble instead of gorge? And that's like
Yeah.
Resmaa Menachem uses that: nibble, don't gorge, right? At trauma.
Yeah.
Just nibble, don't gorge. So that also is welcoming, but it's welcoming within our capacity, right?
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I like that.
Super important to keep in mind. I'm glad we landed there. Yeah. Well, this is awesome, and you have been naming a bunch of resources like Pema Chodron, Thich Nhat Hanh. There was YouTube that we talked about, but I wonder if you have a favorite meditation or mindfulness resource that you would like to share with those who
Mm,
might be listening?
yeah. I think for the relevance of this conversation, I'm gonna offer his name is Sonki Rinpoche. And he has a practice called like beautiful monster handshake. It's called like handshaking and beautiful monsters are kind of like two key elements of it. And you can look it up on YouTube. And he also has like kind of like a course that you can do on his website. But he's a beautiful teacher in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. But you don't need to have any knowledge or terminology of the tradition to do this practice. It's really just exactly what we're talking about. Is he'll name them as beautiful monsters, like these kind of emotions, and it's all about just like, hi, beautiful monster, like please join me and sit with me, and kind of like handshake and making friends with it. And I think he explains it so beautifully. So yeah, that's the resource I'll share because it definitely has done wonders for my ability to kind of like sit with some of these like uncomfortable things and also kind of like love them and have humor around it. I think he just nails it. Yeah, I think it just like really encapsulates this whole discussion.
I love that. I love Togni Rinpoche. He's awesome and amazing. And did you know that he's the brother of Yonggi Migyur Rinpoche?
So I did, and that family, and then his dad's like Tukul Urgyen Rinpoche, and that whole
Yes,
family,
it's
who's
an
also amazing.
amazing, amazing family. So for listeners out there, like years and years worth of exploration just with that family, their writings, their teachings, everything. Just really awesome reference there. Made me excited to hear. That's perfect. We will look up that reference and put the link in the notes underneath this podcast for people who are listening that might want to explore that. Great. Is there anything else on this topic of welcoming or anything else on your mind that you would like to share that I haven't asked about?
I guess the one thing kind of like floating through my brain, I think, is as you said, resources. Because they're just one of my all-time favorite teachers. I'd have to mention like Ram Dass too, in the sense that I think he has a beautiful, just kind of like phrase that he would kind of apply to these kind of things, and it was just like so. And there's been so many moments, and so they're kind of being like, oh, like oh, jealousy, like so, just kind of like seeing it. It's just kind of this practice of just like anger, so, and just kind of like so it's kind of like so practice is like I think a very like welcoming practice too. So yeah, I think I'll conclude as like finding language that works, like just for people to find language that works for them to kind of shift into this, like we said, shift into this openness. And I think there's a lot of resources out there, and you also have a vast inner resource of like that can come up with like creative ways to kind of like do this that like feel good. So I think I just encourage people to be like, yeah, explore with like what feels like a way that shifts me into like welcome. Maybe it's saying like hello, maybe it's just like saying hi and like feeling like you're waving to, like there's so many ways, just like but to find ways to yeah, shift into this mode of welcoming, I think is really, really fruitful work. And it really ties in, I think, in like the deepest, I think it's like the makes us a better person in the world, makes us, for lack of better terms, like better people in the world. And I think it also has like a deep connection to like the deepest like parts of meditation. Like I don't think you can like get much like more like profound than like really working on like welcoming everything in language that works. So yeah.
The other thing I love about what you just said, Brian, is with the so practice is the naming, right? And so to welcome something, you kind of have to know what it is and name it and feel into it, right? And that I think is the fundamental first step of any mindfulness practice is, oh, jealousy. There it is.
Yeah.
That. And then what do I do with it? And then there's the welcoming, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Anger. Ooh, anger. There it is. So what do I do with it now? Can I welcome? right?
Yeah.
Or just a little bit, and that's the titration. So I think
Yeah, even just the naming, but yeah.
when you were describing that, like that's what came to me. I was like, oh, that's the first step. That's the naming.
Yeah. And I think the beauty of that is like once we start shifting into that mode, like we don't even have to try to name. It kind of comes easy. It's not like, oh, and I think it can be like a little trap. There was like, oh, is this gel is almost like too hard, like too hard to name it. You know, I think there's a certain like lightness we need there. It's like, no, like trust it. Like, you know, when it comes up, like don't get too focused on naming. I'd say get focused on feeling it as to the degree you can. And then the name, your innate wisdom will kind of you'll know the name, you'll know what it is. And maybe the name will change as you feel it more. You're like, oh, that wasn't fear, that was grief, actually. But you're not like actively doing that on an intellectual level. You're kind of just feeling it and allowing your feeling to kind of like guide you into what it wants to be named, or what you feel like it should be named. So it's an interesting like line there between like not getting overly like analytical when it comes to the naming, but I think like trusting the feeling. I think these are fundamentally feeling practices, which is why they were so important for me, because I definitely like was kind of hooked on like analytical practices for a while. So I think these feeling practices are really, really fruitful for anyone, but especially people who have kind of like really done a lot of the analytical meditation before.
Yeah, I love that, bringing it back almost to the body, right? Mm-hmm. Bringing it back almost to like the lived experience in our bodies, instead of allowing the thinking to kind of spiral out, which it's always a risk, right? It's always a risk because oftentimes, at least I agree with you, in my life, I've had the same experience, like kind of always living in my head. And so how do you not get trapped in that analytical process and just feel the experience, the actual embodied experience? I love that.
Which I think does bring it back to and then it can easily be like for me, it's like, so I got trapped in my head again. You know what I mean? That again, just kind of like,
and how do you welcome that? And how do you welcome
that? And we're kind of like back to the beginning. Yeah.
And then let it go.
And then let it go. Exactly.
Yeah.
And then so much to practice. And it's exactly. There's like there's some like lines being like like the I think it's the Tibetan tradition, they call it like the kind of like the confusion is the path. I recently saw it in some like the Christian like desert mothers and fathers, but I forget how they called it. I forget, but essentially the language was very similar in the sense of like, well, if I'm not distracted, how am I going to like practice paying attention, was kind of like the idea. So I think that's another like, oh, nice. Like all these distractions are actually really cool abilities for us to practice these things, as opposed to like resenting them. They're actually all opportunities to practice paying attention, or practice welcoming, or practicing whatever it is.
I think that's the perfect way to end. The obstacle is the path, right there.
Yeah.
That's perfect. We'll leave it with that. Well, thank you so much. It has been so much fun. I mean, you and I could probably talk for another 2 hours on just this topic, but it's been really wonderful, and I appreciate you so much, and all the work you've done with us in Awaken, and just the joy that you have around practice and talking about it and sharing it with others. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. It's been, I love it. So I love having the space to be able to nerd out about these things.
Cool.
Say Something Studios.